The Holy Gospel according to St. Matthew, the 14th chapter. Now when Jesus heard this, he withdrew from there in a boat to a deserted place by himself. But when the crowds heard it, they followed Jesus on foot from the towns. And when Jesus went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion for them, and he cured their diseases. When it was evening, the disciples came to him and said, "This is a deserted place, and the hour is now late. Send the crowds away so that they may go into the village and buy food for themselves." Jesus said to them, "They do not need to go away. You give them something to eat." And the disciples replied, "We have nothing here but 5 loaves and 2 fish. And Jesus said, "Bring them here to me." And he ordered the crowds to sit down on the grass. And taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, Jesus looked up to heaven and blessed and broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples. And the disciples gave them to the crowds. And all ate and were filled, and they took up what was left over of the broken pieces, 12 baskets full. And those who ate were about 5,000 men. Also there were women and children. This is the gospel of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Please be seated. Grace to you and peace from our Lord Jesus Christ, the great one who is risen from the dead, not to destroy us, but to feed us and to tell us about God's new creation. Today in our gospel story, Jesus has just come from his hometown of Nazareth, where Matthew tells us because of their unbelief, Jesus was not able to work very many miracles. And so Jesus attempts to withdraw for a while from social relationships and from the crowds. He seeks a lonely place apart. Maybe Jesus was saddened by the news of his friend John the Baptist. At any rate, Jesus is seeking to be re-energized through prayer to his Father. And so Jesus withdraws to a lonely place. But the crowds follow him. They come out on foot from the towns. Matthew says that Jesus had compassion on them and healed their sick. The miraculous power of the love of God usually draws a large crowd, doesn't it? And this story of the feeding of 5,000 plus people is remembered in all 4 of the Gospels. The hour is late. The group is large. The disciples appeal to Jesus, "Send these crowds away into the villages to buy food for themselves." The disciples think that the crowd's basic need for food cannot be met here in this lonely place. The disciples are thinking that they are in a closed system of resources. They get a little anxious. They want to hold on to their meager resources. They want to play it safe and pass the buck to someone else, namely the crowds. But notice how Jesus challenged the disciples. Jesus challenges this kind of attitude. "It is not necessary," said Jesus, "for them to go away. You give them something to eat." God still expects his people, his disciples, to do something about hungry people. The disciples reply to Jesus, "We only have 5 loaves and 2 fish." The other Gospels tell us that a little boy was faced with a decision of whether to hold on to his 5 loaves and 2 fish or to let go of them. Little boy decided to let go of them. Little boy gave them to Jesus, and something wonderful happened. It was something way beyond what the disciples expected. "Bring them here to me," said Jesus. And so the disciples perceive that they are not merely in a lonely place, but they are also with Jesus. Powerful things have been known to happen when one is positioned in the presence of Jesus. Jesus is part of the secret of God's great multiplication tables. Some of our kids will be learning their multiplication tables this year in school. Jesus can make all the difference in the world between scarcity and abundance. And so the disciples bring their meager resources to Jesus for his use in feeding people. Jesus looks up to the Father in heaven and gives thanks, a prayer of thanks, for the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, namely what is available. And then Jesus gives them back to the disciples to give to the hungry crowd. Now, as the disciples are obedient to Jesus, there is enough. Indeed, there is more than enough. And so the disciples fed a huge crowd of people. The disciples can provide people with food because through the presence of Jesus and his prayer of thanksgiving, their meager resources are multiplied by God. God is the great one who knows that people need food to live and who will give good things to those who ask him. Now, we call this story a miracle story, and so it is, but it is also a compassion story. And in fact, elsewhere in Matthew's gospel, Jesus says that when the Son of Man comes in power at the end of time, the question, what did you do in the face of human hunger, will be a question on his final exam. He tells us the question in advance of the exam. What will you do with regard to hungry people? In the face of hungry people all around us, are we holding on? Or are we letting go of our 5 loaves and 2 fish? One of my most rewarding experiences here at Lutheran Church of the Resurrection has been to participate with the Promise Gardeners led by Margaret Perry. This year, so far, we have contributed almost 400 pounds of fresh vegetables, of tomatoes, squash, beans, cucumbers, lettuce, and we've contributed another 100 pounds of canned goods and paper products. Now, we've taken some of the vegetables for ourselves, but there's been enough for us to share with those who are hungry through the Community Assistance Center in Sandy Springs and the Center for Family Resources in Marietta. Many of our people also feed hungry people in our area through Meals on Wheels that Jim Adams coordinates and Must Ministries in Marietta that Jennifer Mazzeros coordinates. And in fact, Ron Jolly is today leading us in a food drive for Must Ministries. So all of these are contemporary examples of how God's multiplication process is at work today in our midst in the name of Jesus to help feed hungry people. Here in this text is the secret of God's great multiplication table. Jesus said to the disciples, "Bring the 5 loaves and the 2 fish here to me." That is, give them up to me. And when they did, they all ate and were satisfied. When we bring our gifts to Jesus, no matter how meager they may seem, then God's secret multiplication process often occurs. It's not gold, it's not the stock market, it's not some rainy day fun that really satisfies. Everything physical is passing away. And as we get older, we find the secret that it's really Jesus who satisfies the deepest hunger of our human hearts. This is so because the greatest hunger of the human heart is a hunger for God, the God who nourishes life. And in Jesus, we find such a God. But in order to discover this secret of life, we have to let go of some of our stockpiles of gold. We have to let go of some of our stockpiles of bread and fish. We have to let go of our false gods in order to have a relationship with the one true God. A mother and her 3-year-old son were shopping for groceries. They approached the checkout line. The contest of wills began as the little boy reached out and grabbed a package of lifesavers. And short of physically prying the lifesavers out of his hand, and in the midst of much screaming, the mother tried to talk the little boy into letting go of the lifesavers. And everyone around who was watching, trying not to look directly, were thinking, will the little boy hold on or will he let go of the lifesavers? For children, the time of 2 to 5 years is a decisive time of learning when to hold on and when to let go. By this time, you see, children have developed some muscle power to exert their willpower in the face of big people, and so they can say no to parents and to brothers and to sisters and to playmates with amazing frequency. Why should they have to share their toys with others? This is the really big question in the lives of preschoolers. And as adults, young and middle-aged and old, we still wrestle with this same question, don't we? Why do we need to share? Why do we need to give up some of what we hold in our hands to benefit others? Why do we need to give up some of what we have to do good to the neighbor and to God? Louise walked into a grocery store. She was a poorly dressed woman with a look of defeat on her face. She spoke to the owner of the grocery store and asked if he would let her charge a few groceries on credit. She softly explained that her husband was sick and unable to work, and they had 7 children, and they needed food. The grocery store owner, a man by the name of John, said he did not know her and he would not extend her credit in his store. Standing nearby was a customer named Harry, who overheard the conversation. Harry walked forward and said to John the grocer that he would cover what she needed. So John the grocer asked, "Do you have a grocery list?" "Yes, sir," said Louise. "Okay," said John the grocer with a bit of maneuvering. "You put your grocery list on this scale, and whatever your grocery list weighs, I will give you that amount in groceries." John the grocer was thinking, of course, that the list would not weigh very much. Louise hesitated a moment, and then she bowed her head and she wrote on a piece of paper that she'd taken out of her purse. She wrote something on the paper, and she laid the paper on the grocery scales. And to everyone's amazement, the scales went down and stayed down. And John the grocer looked at Harry the customer and he said, "I don't believe it." John the grocer finally filled the grocery scales with all of the groceries that Louise requested. And then John the grocer grabbed the piece of paper from the scales. It was not a grocery list. It was a prayer. It said, "Dear Lord, you know my needs, and I'm leaving this in your hands." Well, John gave Louise the groceries he had gathered, and Louise thanked him and she left the store. Harry, the customer, handed a $100 bill to John and said, "It was worth every penny." Sometimes later, John the grocer discovered that his scales were broken. And thus only God knows the weight of that woman's prayer. As big people, hopefully because of Christ, we have learned the wisdom of saying yes to God. And because we belong to God and we want to please God, we can say yes to God, and often we can say yes to other people, to the neighbors who are in need, and ask us for help. Have you discovered the secret of God's multiplication process in his tables, his multiplication tables? Jesus said to the disciples, "Bring the 5 loaves and the 2 fish here to me." And when they did, they all ate and were satisfied. Only God knows how much Jesus' prayer weighed that day in the wilderness, in the lonely place. Grace to you and peace in the name of the great one who has fed a lot more than 5,000 people.